Finally, today, take a look at the political parties today. We want to get a good idea of where the two major parties stand after we've talked about how they've evolved over the last 100 years or so. So let's take a look at the two political parties, of course, embodied here by President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump on the left, and President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama on the right. So we'll see what it is that splits these two parties up and what political parties in the United States are like in general today. Parties today are weaker than they have been, even though they're the main conflict that we see in the media all the time. We talk about political parties a lot, but actually the parties are less powerful than they've ever been. They have a lot less control over the candidates. And we can definitely see that over the last two election cycles, where in the past, we would never see candidates like Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump. They're both too far to the extreme of what their parties stand for, that the leaders of the parties would think that they would be unsuccessful in elections. But the parties don't really have control over who the candidates are. The people voting choose that. And so the parties have a lot less control over the candidates, and the candidates have a lot better access to the people through the mass media. So the candidates don't need the parties, and the people don't listen to the party leaders. The party voters are becoming really polarized. Party voters are becoming more liberal and more conservative, and they're demanding the same thing of party leaders. So party voters have gotten to a point where they punish members of their party for compromise. And so that's the reason we see a lot less compromise in Congress. Is the people in Congress are worried that the voters will turn against them. But people are still very unlikely to be loyal to a political party. What's way more common in the United States today is that people are going to express a dislike for both political parties. We definitely want to make sure that we understand these two terms, because this has been a big deal over the course of our political history with these parties, but also de-alignment is a thing that's happening a lot right now. So let's start at the bottom with party de-alignment. This is where voters are way more likely now to turn away from identifying themselves with a political party. Voters are unlikely to say that they are Democrats or Republicans. They're more likely to call themselves independent, even if they're super liberal or super conservative. People are not likely to switch parties anymore. They're more likely to just quit political parties. So we have a lot less people associated with political parties, and we'll look at that trend in a second. But what we've been looking at so far, we've been looking at a lot of periods of realignment. Now, party realignment occurs one of two ways. An obvious time when there's realignment is when a minor party, like a third party, replaces one of the two major parties. So we saw a couple of those. We saw the Whigs replace the Federalists, and then we saw the Republicans place the Whigs. So that's one form of party realignment. But the much more common form of party realignment is when the coalition inside the party changes. A demographic group that has been loyal to one party may switch to the other. So we'll see that. We saw that in the 1960s as African American voters shifted from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. We saw the same thing with the South. The South shifted from the Democrats to the Republicans in the late 60s, early 70s. We think we're seeing that now with working class voters shifting from a long period of party loyalty to the Democrats to maybe becoming more of a solid voting bloc for the Republicans. So this is the more common form of party realignment, but it's not as obvious to see. Here's a look at the groups that make up the coalitions for the two political parties today. So we're just splitting up different demographic groups among who's Democrat and who's Republican. But you can see, you can see where there are big blue bars. Those are groups that are very loyal to the Democratic Party, and big red bars are groups that are very loyal to the Republican Party. So we'll see that that Democrats are going to have a lot of support among African American voters, Jewish voters, Hispanic voters, and poorer voters, labor union voters as well, and women. Republicans are going to get most of their support from white evangelicals and people with incomes above 100,000. So there's less groups there, but those groups are more loyal and more more reliable voters. Those groups are voting in every election and they're very loyal to the Republican Party, whereas the groups that make up the Democratic coalition often have to be like encouraged to vote. So these are the coalitions that make up the parties, but it doesn't really reflect the fact that that Democrats are always winning elections, which is what you might think if you look at this chart. It's way more even balance between the two parties. We've looked at maps like this a lot before, but it is important for us to see where the parties get their political support. So we take a look at this map. This is a county by county representation of the presidential election. So we see that Democrats are likely to have a lot of support on the West Coast. Democrats are likely to have a lot of support in the Northeast and a little in the Midwest. There's a belt through the South where there's a lot of African American voters that the Democrats rely on for support. And then Republicans get support everywhere else. So if we look at this map, we might think that there's overwhelming support for Republicans across the country. However, if we look at this map shows us where the people actually live. So on this map, the populations of the counties that are blue is greater than the population of the counties that are gray. So we have to keep in mind that while, like, if we look at a map, we see Republicans taking up most of the space, that does not reflect that they have the support of most of the people. So it's really important that we understand where people live in the United States when we're looking at maps of political support. But it is also important for us to know where the two parties get their support, because the United States election systems are based on geography. The Congress is based on geography. So having spread out political power is going to be really advantageous in the United States system. This is just a really good visualization. Now, this is from the 2008 election. So there's definitely been some shifts, but these patterns are mostly the same. What we see here we see the margin of victory represented by towers. So we see that it's pretty close in a lot of these rural areas. There are some Republican wins and some Democratic wins, but it's pretty evenly split in low population areas. But then in our big cities, you see a huge tower for Chicago, a huge one over for LA, big towers up in the Northeast around different parts of New York, around Boston, and things like that. And then we also see there are some strong Republican cities. So around the outskirts, I see a big chunk around the outside of Nashville, around the outside of Dallas, over south of Phoenix and around Salt Lake City. So there are some big strongholds for Republicans and some very, very massive strongholds for Democrats among our cities. And here's something we talked about, but we can see it. We can see it graphically here. So the trends in party affiliation, one of the most important things for us to remember is that Americans are identifying with a political party less and less. More and more Americans are calling themselves independent. So the two charts represent the same thing. On the left, it just goes farther back, so we can compare a kind of modern time with as far back as the 1950s. So we can see when there was a lot of party loyalty among Democrats, which has fallen over time, and there was significant party loyalty among Republicans, and there were very few independents. But that starts to grow over the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 2000s. And then the bigger graph on the right just shows us a more detailed breakdown here. So there have been periods where the largest number of Americans consider themselves to be independent, and that would be true since 2008. So there have been like high points for Republicans and for Democrats, but in general, more Americans consider themselves to be independent than either of the two political parties. And the two political parties are really both at a low point in terms of how people identify themselves. Another trend we're seeing with our parties is polarization, meaning that the parties are becoming more ideologically divided than they have been in the past. So this shows us what the median Republican and the median Democrat would have been like back in 1994, and we see that they're very, very close together, and the same is true even in 2004. But by 2014, those Republicans and Democrats have become more spread apart. They've become more consistently liberal and more consistently conservative. That's because the voters are forcing them that way. If we think back to the last chart, if most Americans are independent, then the only Democrats left are extremely loyal, and the only Republicans left are extremely loyal, which means they're more likely to be liberal and conservative. The voters are the ones that are forcing the parties to become more conservative and more liberal. The voters are punishing members of their own party for things like compromise, and that's driving our parties farther apart. We've got a couple of things causing that. A big one would be mass media. Because of mass media, the candidates have better access to the voters, and the voters have better access to the candidates. And all of this is without the interference of the political parties. So the candidates can spread their message without the parties, and the candidates can attract voters on their own. So the candidates don't need the parties the same way they used to, and the voters don't associate with the parties in order to learn about the candidates. So because media connects us so well, and especially since the internet, media is connecting us with candidates easier and easier, and so people don't rely on the political parties the way they used to. That's one of the big reasons why people are associating themselves with political parties less and less. Because of the spread of the internet, candidates don't rely on the parties at all. Candidates can email voters directly. Candidates can put things on YouTube and not worry even about the media altering their message or controlling what they want to say, what kind of message they want to get to the people. People can speak directly to candidates with platforms like Twitter and through mass emails and things like that. Candidates have also used the internet to raise money, and so they don't rely on the party to raise money anymore. So they're less likely to follow the directions of the party in return for the fundraising. So here, if the candidates are raising the money on the internet, they're raising small amounts of money from a lot of people. But the kind of people that donate to candidates tend to be very liberal or very conservative. So this is helping to force the candidates from the two parties to be even farther apart than they used to be. So the last thing we have to think about is we got to think about what political parties are going to be like in the future. Like, what role will they play? They've got to change up a lot based on how things have been going, as fewer people see them as necessary connectors to the government, necessary linkages. So parties have to work a lot to reestablish themselves as links for the people. They've got to find some way to make themselves an important role like they used to be. So the voters themselves using the internet and media, and politicians making use of the media, they've done a lot to eliminate the importance of political parties as like that link between the people and the government. The candidates are still going to rely on the parties a little bit. The candidates are going to need to be able to call themselves the Democrat and the Republican, because voters, that's what we do. We still only vote for Democrats and Republicans. So the parties will play a permanent role in American presidential politics, but people are less and less likely to make themselves a part of the party. Young people really rarely join political parties. I'm sure you guys probably don't know anyone who's like actually registered with a political party. And even though you may be super liberal or super conservative, you're probably going to call yourself independent or not associate yourself with a party because of how the parties handle things. So the parties got to figure out their role in the future, because the way things have been going make the parties less and less important all the time. Can't think of a better party than President Trump and Lil Jon hanging out together. So let's take a minute and go back over our bigly ideas from today. So in all the history stuff that we were talking about today, the things we need to make sure we can do is we can describe previous examples of party realignments. So we've got a couple kinds. Remember, a minor party replacing a major party. So you can think about when the Whigs replaced the Federalists, or when the Republicans replaced the Whigs. But we can also think about when the coalitions or the demographics of the party changed. So when did the South go from Democrat to Republican? When did African Americans go from Republican to Democrat? Are working class voters changing from one to the other? So that's really important. It's also really important for us to be able to make distinctions about Democrats in the 1800s and Democrats after the New Deal. So they have basically opposite ideas about what government should be doing. But that's the kind of thing that you're expected to know on the AP test. So you'll have to be able to say, that Democrats in the 1800s were like a states' rights party and they were pro-slavery and all that, but that the Democrats of the middle of the 1900s they're building a welfare state, and they are very protective of civil rights. We want to be able to describe the makeup of the party coalitions today, like what groups make up the bulk of Republicans and what groups make up the bulk of Democrats. And it's really important for us to think about de-alignment and how the future of political parties is a little bit in jeopardy. The candidates need them for the actual election. The candidates need them for primaries and things, but the voters don't seem to feel like they need political parties anymore. All right, guys, that's it for our kind of rundown of the history of political parties. So we've talked about all kind of stuff about our main parties. We've talked about the two-party system and the history of these parties. We talked about the organization and what the parties do, and we focused mostly about winning elections. But now we've got to spend just a little time talking about weird political parties that know that they can't possibly win an election and try to figure out why they participate anyway. So we'll be talking about minor parties next.